Good evening, everyone. I'm Jonathan Lev, Executive Director here at the Boulder JCC, and I'm only doing a quick welcome because you're going to get a lot more from my great friend and our great friend, Larry Cohn. It is my pleasure to be able to welcome you all here to this really important lecture that's part of a lecture series that we've run over the course of years because of an incredible endowment that Larry had the vision to be able to bring to this community, to bring Holocaust education to the community, and many, many other donors have contributed to make that possible as well. And so tonight's speaker, Professor Veidlinger, we're thrilled to be able to have him here with us in Boulder. And with that, I get to welcome Larry up to the stage.
Thank you, Jonathan. My name's Larry Cohn. In 2018, our community lost a dear member, a Holocaust survivor, Irene Rosenschein. Irene was a dear, dear friend of mine. She was generous, she was kind, she was resilient. She was, in a word, inspiring. She spoke to schools, B'nai Mitzvah classes, churches. She made her history, her experience in the Holocaust, a living history. And we're here tonight to honor Irene and to hear the remarks of Professor Veidlinger. I seeded the fund in recognition and memory of my dear friend Irene. I turned it over to the professionals, and I thank Jonathan and Nancy and everybody at the J that has made this program as successful as it is. The intent was to allow Boulder and the Boulder JCC to bring scholars, films, and art for generations to come in our community. I invite you to join me in supporting this endeavor. It is a dedicated fund on the JCC website. And it's grown considerably in the 7 years since it was established. This weekend, the Boulder JCC opened a traveling exhibit. It's on display now for the next month, The Bias Inside. Certainly not too far removed from Holocaust and Holocaust experiences and life during that time. Thank you. Our speaker this evening is going to share, unfortunately, what happens when our bias goes unchecked. It's also timely that our program tonight falls on the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Professor Veidlinger, Jeffrey Veidlinger, is the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. His latest book, In the Midst of Civilized Europe, The Pogroms of 1918 to 1921, and the Onset of the Holocaust, which has won several awards, including the National Jewish Book Award. I'm sorry to share the news the Boulder Bookstore was unable to get copies of the book in time for the presentation tonight. Hopefully you will be able to go soon and purchase the book from your favorite bookstore. Professor Veidlinger is also the author of award-winning books In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small-Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine, The Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Jewish Culture on the Soviet Stage, and Jewish Public Culture in the late Russian Empire. Following Professor Veidlinger's talk tonight, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Please wait for the microphone to come around so folks on the live stream can hear your questions and Professor Veidlinger's answers. Thank you for coming tonight. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome our speaker, Professor Veidlinger.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Nancy, for organizing this, and thank you all for coming. I'm just going to get my slideshow up here. There we go. And here you can see the cover of the book that the bookstore was unable to get, but it's still available to get otherwise. I do want to acknowledge, as was just said, that today is the 3rd year anniversary of what has been an absolutely brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine and war going on in Ukraine over the last 3 years. I myself have spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I spent a lot of time there doing research for this book and doing research for the book that I wrote before this book, which was a collection of oral history testimonies of Holocaust survivors in Ukraine. We went around to small towns throughout Ukraine and interviewed elderly Yiddish speakers, and I got to know the country very well. And I want to say that the story that I'm going to tell today about the pogroms in Ukraine between 1918 and 1921 is not a pretty story. And in many ways, Ukrainians don't come out very well in this story. They don't in the story of the Holocaust either. And I want to put that out there because I think it's important that Vladimir Putin has used as a pretext for the war he started, the claim that Ukrainians are Nazis. And I just want to state outright the falsity of that accusation. There was a time, and I'm going to talk about that time today, in which Ukraine was infiltrated with Nazism, as tragically were many countries throughout Europe. But certainly since 1991, in the last, whatever that is, 35 years or so, Ukraine has seen 3 revolutions, 3 separate occasions when masses of Ukrainians took to the streets to overthrow a government and in order to bring about a new government. And in all 3 of those occasions, they have taken to the streets to get rid of Russian autocratic and dictatorial governments, and instead they have rallied for really an idealized version of a pluralistic, liberal, and free Western Europe. In 1991, in 2014, and in 2019, there were these revolutions that took place, and I think it's very important to remember what the Ukrainians were able to accomplish in the last 35 years. And it's that fight for freedom, liberty, pluralism that actually began in the period that I'm going to talk about today, but that continues to this day, that Ukrainians are fighting and dying in order to protect for Europe. So I just wanted to state that at the outright, given that this is the 3rd year anniversary of the start of that war. And I'm not going to talk about it all that much during the talk, but I'm happy to take any questions during the question period about the current war as well. But really, I want to start this talk with the Holocaust, and with a version of the Holocaust that I grew up hearing, and I'm sure many of us grew up hearing as well. And I'd like to start with this photo of my father, Otto Veidlinger, sitting on his father's lap outside their apartment in Budapest in 1944. This photo is a photo that sat on my father's desk for his entire life. And, I would go in and look at it, and we'd see it looks like a perfectly normal photo, a happy photo of a father and his son, until you realize that they're wearing yellow stars. And that points out kind of a sudden change that took place. And it's a narrative of the Holocaust that many of us, me included, grew up with. And, my father, who actually passed away about a year ago, we're approaching the yahrzeit on March 1st of his passing, but my father would talk about his childhood in Hungary. And he had a fantastic childhood in Budapest. He would go skiing in the Alps, and he took fencing lessons, and there was a park that he used to love to go to, and he went to the Orthodox synagogue regularly. He had a very nice childhood. And then the way he told it, suddenly things changed on a dime. From one day to the next, that childhood was wiped away, and the Nazis came into Hungary and destroyed it. And that's a very true version of his childhood. I just want to show you some some sketches that he drew when he was 8 years old that we recently discovered. And this is a picture of his Budapest from when he grew up. Again, he was 8 years old. This is 1944. You can see it's a colorful city with green trees and some blue trees for some reason. There's the Buda Castle up at the top with the Hungarian flag flying. And it looks like a picture that a child would make of an idyllic village or an idyllic city in which they're growing up. A few months later, in the same sketchbook, my father drew this picture, which shows you the drastic changes that war brings about through the eyes of an 8-year-old. Gone are the colorful trees, gone is the blue sky, and instead everything is black and crooked and angry. You can see there's a plane flying through the sky with a swastika on it. And here my father has drawn his house with his name on it, Ferko, and his best friend growing up, Zuzana, who lived in the house next door. He also drew her name on the house. And you can see gone is the era of plenitude that he grew up with. And it's a lesson of how quickly things really can change. And it's a lesson that people in Ukraine saw just 3 years ago as well. From one day to the next, I spent the summer before COVID, I spent in Ukraine. And it was, a beautiful place, as it had always been. And then to suddenly be transformed overnight by war, this sort of thing happens. This is also, I think, the vision of the Holocaust that many of us got from the writings of Elie Wiesel, for instance. For those of you who have read Night, you know that he talks about his idyllic childhood, and then suddenly things changed on a dime when the Nazis invaded. We see it in popular narratives. We see it in the Diary of Anne Frank as well. There used to be a Holocaust museum near where I live right now in Michigan, in which you would walk into the museum and there would be a big open room, kind of like a room like this, and there were all of these displays all around the room where one had images of the lively political life in Poland before the wars, another had all of the newspapers in different languages that were printed, another had Jewish religious symbols and figures, spice boxes and menorahs, and then suddenly you would go out of that room and there was a very narrow corridor going downwards, and at the bottom of that corridor was a huge portrait of Adolf Hitler. Again, giving the impression that everything changed on a dime. And again, that is a true narrative. But I want to point to a different narrative, and this is where I connect these pogroms, these anti-Jewish race riots that took place in Ukraine between 1919 and 1921, that I think are intimately connected to the violence 20 years later, to the Holocaust 20 years later. And I became aware of this when I was doing oral history interviews in Ukraine that I mentioned. I did these through a project called the Archives of Historical and Ethnographic Yiddish Memories, or a HAME, which means homeward in Yiddish. And me and my colleague Dov Ber-Kurler, who you see sitting next to me, went around and we interviewed elderly Yiddish speakers about their lives, about how they lived under communism and how they lived under the Holocaust and how they survived. And Dov Ber Professor Kurler was a Yiddish linguist. So he was interested in tracing the ways that the Yiddish language changes from place to place and the different accents in different regions. But as they were talking, they were also telling us stories that I thought were incredible stories. And they were telling us stories about violence that they endured, not only during the Holocaust, but in these pogroms between 1919 and 1921. Now, I knew, as most historians knew, that there had been pogroms between 1919 and 1921 in Ukraine. But I don't think any of us realized quite the extent of them, how many people were actually killed in them. About 100,000 people were killed. 100,000 Jews were killed in about 1,000 separate incidents of violence between 1919 and 1921, perpetrated by a wide variety of armies and perpetrators against Jews. And this, again, only 20 years before the Holocaust. And what makes us realize this is first the realization that the mass killing of the Holocaust only begins in the summer of 1941, once the Germans invade the areas of the former Soviet Union in Ukraine. There had been ghettos that were established before, there were legal restrictions on Jews, and there were killings in camps that were established in Germany and in the ghettos that were established in Poland. But the type of mass killing that's became emblematic of the Holocaust began over the summer of 1941 with the invasion of the Soviet Union and the invasion of Ukraine, precisely where these pogroms took place 20 years earlier. And then the realization that many of the perpetrators of the pogroms of 1941 were the same people who perpetrated these pogroms in 1919. In 1919, they tended to be young people. They tended to be teenagers, and they're 18, 19 years old. 20 years later, they were police officers in their mid-30s, early 40s, who often perpetrated atrocities against Jews. So there is this connection. And then the way that people that we interviewed spoke about the two sets of violence also struck me. They would use the term pogrom, which we usually think of as more of a localized type of ethnic riot. They would use that term to describe both the violence of 1919 and the violence of 1941. And they would also use the term Aktion, the German term to describe a mass killing, to talk about the mass killings that took place in 1919 to 1921. And there's a few things that we've come to realize in Holocaust research. One of those is that the Holocaust was not as mechanized as we used to think it was. There's this image that Hannah Arendt famously talked about, the Holocaust being perpetrated by bureaucrats, by people pushing paper, of it being mass industrialized killing. And that's true. It certainly was mass industrialized killing, but it was also very close hand killing. In fact, about 2 million people were killed in the territories that became Ukraine and Belarus that I'm going to talk about, and they were killed mostly at close range. They were often killed by people who knew them, who killed them in the same towns in which they grew up and in which they lived. This is not the image that we have of trains being moved across Europe, and people of Eichmann having timetables of trains that he's pushing. These are actually people who knew the victims, taking them to the edge of town and massacring them in a forest. Very similar to the type of violence that we associate with pogroms, rather than the type of violence that we associate with, say, Auschwitz. At the same time, we've come to understand that the pogroms of 1919 were perpetrated not only by local toughs, were not only inter-ethnic village violence, but were also perpetrated by military units who came into town in order to kill people. So they have a lot more in common than we imagined when you look at this violence over the summer of 1941. I'm going to play you a few little clips of interviews that we did, and I'll talk a bit about what they say and how this relates. So the first is an interview that we conducted in the town of Tulchin, which is between Kiev and Odessa. If you can picture Kiev and Odessa, it's about midway in between. And we interviewed a fellow by the name of Nisan Yurkovetsky. Yurkovetsky was born in 1917. He was about 18 months old when this pogrom took place in the town of Tulchin. And as we were talking to him, he unrolled his sleeve and showed us the scar along his arm where the bullets that killed his mother ricocheted across his arm as his mother was holding her in his arms. His family, his mother and he and his father as well, were killed in this mass grave and left to die. And a priest was walking by a little bit later and saw that in this mass grave in which people had been shot into, there was a baby that was still alive. And so the priest took the baby out, and that was Nisan Yurkovetsky, and found other relatives for him to live with. And that's his story, and that's the story that he's going to tell us. So I want to play his narrative of the Tulchin pogrom. Obviously, he was 18 months old at the time, so he doesn't remember this. It's not his own memory he's telling us, but it's the story that he has been told over time about what happened to him. The interview is in Yiddish. Anybody understand Yiddish? Very well. If not, it's subtitled, so that'll help. And if you don't understand Yiddish, well, maybe you will. Maybe you'll understand more than you think.
Schick hat gegessen, mein Vater.
Vater hat gegessen, Schick.
Schick in 19 Jahren gereinigt. Mein Vater mit einem Meter aus dem Draget.
In 19 Jahren, das gewesen, in ganzen 2 Jahren.
Oh,
Wer hat sich da gegeben?
Bandeljachowitsch,
Bandeljachowitsch.
hat geschossen, der Bandit. Ist der geflogen, der Pulle. Hat es, hat Semen. Und da kriegt sie Porach. Wieder.
Ja, was das schon, ja.
Hat man hintergenommen. Apolik. Apolik hat man hintergenommen. Das ist übrigens der Aktionsafnugel. Und hat man auch angenommen.
Gerottet.
Da, gerottet, man hat geschollen, wird man. Hat ein bei mir auf Futter. Wenn bei mir ein paar gemacht auf Futter. Auch so, bei mir ein paar gemacht auf Futter. In einem Meter. In einer Seide, ein Schnader.
Wie hat der Meter gegessen?
Giekel.
Beide sind gewesen von dort, von
Schicke, ja.
Schick ist von Tulchin.
Ne, Schicke, der Futtermann hat gegessen Schicke.
Ja, er ist von Tulchin.
Ja. Ich bin ein paar gemacht. Hat nicht gefragt, im 19. Jahr. Ich bin ein Pogrom. In Tulchin, immer ausgegangen, das war gewesen. Zusammen nicht, das war ausgegangen, mehr Rosselele. Ist er ausgegangen, ein Gordischer, ein Golach. Barduchan. En dat ze uitprobeerde de banditen hele. En zijn het ook weer van Ladege.
Okay, so there you have his version of what he has been told took place in Tulchin in 1919. A few things I want to point out. For one, who the culprits are. He knows their name. It's the Lyachovich gang. The Lyachovich gang were a group of local peasants led by a guy named Lyachovich. And they came into town and they carried out this massacre of the Jewish population. So you have to picture a little village and there's a countryside outside. The peasants are living in the countryside, the Christian peasants live in the countryside, and the Jews predominantly live in the city. And the Lyachovich gang comes in and they perpetrate these atrocities. So this is killing where people know each other. It's very close personal killing in which the victims know the perpetrators. You can see in this is a testimony I found in the YIVO archives in New York from 1919. Nisan Yurkovetsky has no idea that this testimony was written. It was taken by a group of activists who were trying to document pogroms in the immediate aftermath. And you can see here, if you can read any Yiddish, this says Lyachovich, and this says Lyachovich in Russian. So you can see that they use the same name, that this actually is backed, his version is backed by another, is backed by these documents. You can see here that the pogrom also, it says it took place in late July, the beginning of August 1919. And this account says 500 people were killed during this pogrom. And this account also says that the pogrom took place over the course of 24 hours, whereas Yurkovitsky said it took place over 8 days. So there we have a little bit of a difference in the two testimonies. However, this testimony says there were several pogroms that took place over the course of a week. So it's really just a matter of what you count as the pogrom, right? These people are counting, the person who wrote this testimony is counting each individual incident as a separate pogrom, whereas Yurkovitsky's narrative counts them all together. And then this testimony also has the same story, that a priest came and chased away the bandits. He says it right here. There is a delegation of priests, he says, and one of them chased away the bandits, it says in Yiddish. So we have the exact same accounts in this pogrom. This pogrom was also, huge numbers of people killed, but it's a small enough scale pogrom still that a priest is able to chase away the bandits. Somebody is able to come into the village, somebody of authority, and say, stop, enough already, go home everybody. And they do. And that's significant, because there's going to come a time very soon after where even a priest can't stop the pogrom. But it just shows the importance of acting very quickly, that at the very beginning, if somebody of authority says stop it, people will stop it, or at least they did in the case of Tulchin. I want to show you some statistics about Tulchin that I think are interesting. This is the occupational distribution, Jews versus Christians, in Tulchin according to the census of 1926. And you'll see that Yurkovetsky talked a lot in that interview about the professions of everybody, that his father was a hairdresser or a barber, he says repeatedly, for instance. And this is because that was the way that people identified. People identified themselves very much by their profession. And there were certain professions that were Jewish professions. You can see here that about 90% of all of the barbers or hairdressers were Jewish. About 70% of the coopers, 97% of the glaziers, of the glassmakers, coachmen, tailors, dentists, doctors, all tended to be Jewish. Whereas on the other hand, railroad workers and farmers were almost all entirely Christian. So the population was very much demarcated by profession. And you see that also in this chart, which shows the distribution of the population in Ukraine by rural or urban population in 1926. You can see that about 90% of all people living in Ukraine lived in rural communities, and 11% lived in urban communities, whereas by contrast, 91% of Jews in Ukraine lived in the cities, and only 9% lived in the countryside. So there really was a stark division between the town and the country in Ukraine. So when these bandits, as they say, are coming from the countryside into the town to attack Jews, this is also town versus country. It's also the people who regard themselves as having been cut off, as the economically disadvantaged peasants in the neighborhoods going into the cities to attack the stores. So that's one model of pogrom. Another model of pogrom that I want to show you, what took place in the town of Proskurov. And this was February 15th, 1919. Over the course of 4 hours on February 15th, 1919, somewhere between 1,000 to 1,500 Jews were killed in a violent pogrom in the town of Proskurov. Probably very few have heard of this, have heard of the Proskurov pogrom. It was the single largest killing of Jews before the Holocaust. There's no other episode in which there was as many people killed concentrated in such a short period of time as the Proskurov pogrom. Very significant act of violence. And in this case, it was a military faction. It was an armed military unit that came into town and systematically went door to door killing Jews. And I'm going to play you a testimony of Naum Geiviker, who talks about it. In this case, you'll see, Naum Geiviker is sitting next to his wife. His wife actually tells the story while he nods along. And then he tries to interrupt to tell his story, and she cuts him off. So just a little dynamic going on there. So this is also kind of problematic as an oral history testimony, but nevertheless, you get the point of the story.
Also gewesen 6 Jahre ist gewesen der Pogrom gewesen. Und der Groß, was hat gewohnt zusammen Jiden.
Wer gehst du in der Groß?
Saborn hat geheißen der Groß. Pesant, Is
Das
das
ist ein Center, das ist ein Center Stutt.
da wie der Market ist
Ja.
da bei uns. Wer ist uns erkennt Bolten, hat sich geboten, aber wir sind ungefähr ja Schiedene. Da. Da Tochter Sana mit der Eltern, mit der kleineren Schwester, um später zu gehen auf den Boden, und hat sich dort geboten. Mit der Matschach, der gestanden hinten. Und der ganze Gast hat nun gehen Argen in die Iden. Man muss nun sagen in die Iden. Und wir sagen zu seinen Stiebern, gibt Gold oder belohnt gibt. Und sie sind gewinnt stark Kuren, so haben gar nicht Gold, so haben wir haben gar nicht. Ob die Gäste gar nicht, dann muss sie aufnehmen den Kopf. Na, wo hat er getan in Drößen, haben sie nicht gewusst, aber sie haben nur gehört, haben geschrien, gewollt hat geschrien. In der Zeit hat nun gegeben zu farfen. Wir sollen sich Sebereien, die Natscheißwe, sollen sich Sebereien, und genommen der Bandit, das hat sich gewollt Argenen, und hat genommen der Schaschgesanen, hat angelegt im Futlar, und ist rausgegangen. In der Zeit sind sie geblieben leben. Nur wenn sie nach Hause gegangen in Drößen, haben sie gesehen, du liegen Käpp, du liegen Ent, du liegen Fies, und alle seine Chavere haben Neues gearbeitet. Und ist mit der Matschach geblieben leben. Wofür alle Jungen haben sich gemischt, alle Jungen.
In nur dem seinen Ahn, der Paljaken, hat sie genommen dem Toten, von dem Geduschen, als nicht gewesen, wir haben gemeint, mit ihm gearbeitet, mit ihm hat sie genommen, jetzt in der Welt, so gesogen, die Ambasure, die haben, wopschen sie gewesen, freilich du. Ich habe überlebt, die...
Wofür alle, wo es hat sie getroffen, hat er selber gelebt.
Okay. So there you see, again, a different testimony of a different type of pogrom, this one carried out by military units. So we heard in the interviews that we were conducting, that my team was conducting, we heard many accounts like this of people who survived atrocities of unimaginable horror between 1918 and 1921. Again, 20 years. Remember, when you're listening to this, it sounds like a Holocaust testimony, but this is 20 years before the Holocaust, again, in the very same towns in which some of the first massacres of the Holocaust took place. The Proskurov pogrom in particular, we actually know a fair amount about, in addition to these testimonies. There were local activists who went into the towns after these massacres took place and took testimonies of all of the people who had witnessed it or who had lost relatives. And this is one page of a larger document documenting the names of people killed in the Proskurov pogrom. And you can see the last name, it goes up to 911. So we have 911 names of individuals killed during this 4-hour period in February 1919. Here's a stamp by the rabbi. And you can see the ages of the victims. And they range, I mean, I don't know if I can totally see it here, but they range. There's some that are a few months old, 8 months old, 2 years old, 4 years, 7 years, up to elderly people, 90 years old. There's men and women listed on this. This is clearly an exterminationist pogrom. This is not just targeting certain members of the town or certain intellectuals or warriors or anything. This is violence against men, women, and children that took place in this town. Here you have little surveys that were done with inspectors who went door to door collecting names, collecting data. In one particular family, you can see here, there were 5 people killed. One was 11, one was 15, one was 12, one was 2, and one was 33 are the ages of those killed in this family. And then there's another survey that was answered describing that pogrom. The pogrom actually became, the Proskurov pogrom in particular, became pretty famous. This is a memorial book written about the Proskurov pogrom. I actually start my book with this image of this memorial because it looks like a Holocaust memorial. It's got the barbed wire, and the candles, all of the symbols of the Holocaust with the Podolian, the Ukrainian countryside in the background. But this was actually written in 1924, this book, and it commemorates the Proskurov pogrom, this first pogrom from 1919. Anyway, it became famous also because the head of the Ukrainian state at the time was a guy by the name of Simon Petlura. Anybody heard of Simon Petlura? So if you've heard of Simon Petlura, he was the head of the Ukrainian state. The Ukrainian state was established at this time as an opposition state to the communists, to the Red Army, to the Soviet state. And Petlura was blamed for the pogroms. I'll say a little bit unfairly. He wasn't actually all that responsible for them. He could have done more to stop them, but he was not a pogrom monger. He was nevertheless blamed for the pogroms. And in 1926, in Paris, a Jewish survivor by the name of Sholem Schwarzbard, who was a poet and actually a watchmaker, saw Petlura at a bookstore. And he thought, this is the guy who is responsible for the pogroms. So he went home and looked in an encyclopedia that he had for a picture of Petlura and saw it confirmed it was the same guy. So he started going back to that bookstore every day looking for him and found him another day and shot him and killed him. And he was arrested, and the trial became a major trial, headlines around the world, of this trial of Sholem Schwarzbard. And Sholem Schwarzbard claimed that he had killed Petlura because Petlura was an evil person responsible for the pogroms. And Schwarzbard won in court. He was acquitted by the French court and freed on those grounds. This actually created a big schism between the Jewish and the Ukrainian community. It's kind of a complicated story, but again, Petlura was not actually responsible for the pogroms. And a lot of Jews supported Petlura and liked Petlura. But once Sholem Schwarzbard killed him, then it really divided the communities. Anyway, it's an interesting side story of this whole thing. It's in the book as well, the story. But anyway, here's a map I put together that shows you where a lot of the pogroms took place. Again, during this period between 1918 and 1921, there were about 1,000 pogroms in which about 100,000 people were killed. And you can see the circles in this. I don't know how well you can see, but the circles signify how many people were killed in each town, which Proskurov over here being the largest of the pogroms with about 1,000 to 1,500 people killed. And you can see all of these other pogroms taking place. So when I came across this and discovered the extent of the violence, I was kind of amazed that I didn't know about it. And that other people didn't know about it either, that it just wasn't such a big deal. So I was curious, did people know about it at the time? Was this major news in 1919? And I started looking around and saw that actually it was major news. And in fact, between 1919 or between 1921 really and 1941, it was in many ways all that anybody was talking about. And I came across this headline in the New York Times. This is from September 8th, 1919. Ukrainian Jews aim to stop pogroms. I just want to read, mass meeting hears that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril. And I want to read you the last line from this New York Times article. It says, this fact that the population of 6 million souls in Ukraine and in Poland have received notice through action and by word that they are going to be completely exterminated. This fact stands before the whole world as the paramount issue of the present day, from September 1919. And this isn't a rarity. If you look through, I actually have in the book many other examples from Reader's Digest. I did a special issue on the coming destruction of European Jews. The Nation, the journal The Nation did a special issue, also did a whole article on the murder of the Jews, the murder of a race, they called it, talking about this. And in fact, the Jewish community also responded in force. I mean, the Jewish, I was wondering, why didn't anybody do anything to stop it if they saw this coming? And the answer, tragically, is they did a lot to try to stop it. It just wasn't enough. But the Jewish community petitioned the world powers, who were at this very moment, literally at the time of the Proskurov pogrom in February 1919, the world powers were meeting in Paris to work out the treaty that would end the war and would be signed as Versailles. The Versailles Treaty was being negotiated at this time. And they the Jewish community sent representatives to those peace talks in order to argue that Poland and Romania, that the new states being established, should put minority rights into their constitutions in order to protect Jews and prevent a pogrom from taking place again. And this happened. Romania and Poland put in constitutional guarantees that there would be minority rights for the Jews. The Jewish community also petitioned for the establishment of their own state in Palestine. And that was taking place as well. There was an established, as you know, this was the beginnings of the real movement towards the establishment of the State of Israel, began already during this time in large part in response to these pogroms. Jews left Ukraine in massive numbers. They fled westward when they could before the border was closed, and they fled eastward. They fled into Moscow and St. Petersburg as well. So people did do a lot to prevent what they saw as the coming destruction, but it just wasn't enough. I want to talk for a minute about who the perpetrators of these pogroms were, because this is where also it gets kind of interesting. The Ukrainian state in which these pogroms took place was a state that had just been established. Ukraine used to be a part of the Russian Empire. And as the Russian Empire, Ukraine was divided between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but as these empires collapsed with the end of World War I, or during World War I, the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, new states started to be established in their absence. One of those states was the Soviet Union, was Bolshevik Russia. Another state was the state of Poland, and another was the state of Ukraine. Ukraine ended up getting crushed and taken over by Russia and incorporated into the Soviet Union. But for a brief period, there was an independent Ukrainian state. And that state was a multicultural, pluralistic state that promoted equality for all the peoples who lived in it. This was a very progressive idea in 1918 and 1919. And this is currency that state printed. And you'll see that they printed their currency with Ukrainian on one side, and on the other side, Russian, Polish, and Yiddish. This is, as far as I know, the only currency printed with the Yiddish language on it, really ever. Probably there's been some US currency, but certainly up until that point, or Israeli currency, but certainly up to that point, with Yiddish language on it, it was very rare to have currency. And the Ukrainian state allowed for Yiddish to be used in the court of law. They allowed for schooling to take place in Yiddish. They even had a a minister of Jewish nationality issues in the government, in the cabinet. There was a ministerial position to look at Jewish affairs. So this Ukrainian state imagined itself to be a really multicultural, pluralistic state, such that the Jewish world rejoiced at the establishment of this state. This is from Der Tag, a Yiddish newspaper in New York, stating that for the first time in all Jewish history, the Jewish people will be recognized by a government as an equal part of the general population, not only in a civil and political sense, but in a national sense. So the world was rejoicing at this Ukrainian multicultural, pluralistic Ukrainian state. And in fact, by the way, the term multiculturalism itself originated from Ukrainians, from Ukrainian emigres to Canada, were the first to use that phrase in reference to the Ukrainian state, or drawing from the Ukrainian state. But yet, as authority broke down in the face of a Russian invasion, the state was established in 1918, Russia invaded, and the state collapsed. And in the collapse of the state is when all of this violence took place. And here is an attempt to count who actually perpetrated the violence. And you'll see it says here the Poles perpetrated 38 pogroms, Petlura, so the Ukrainians 54, the Russians 93, and then this category of bandits, 509 pogroms. I just want to talk a little bit about this because the Jews were really caught in the middle. There was a massive war going on between all sides, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, and Tsarist Russia and Bolshevik Russia, all vying for power. and all fighting each other. And the Jews were caught in the middle by all parties. The Bolsheviks targeted the Jews because they thought the Jews were capitalists. The Jews lived in the city, they were entrepreneurs, they were merchants and traders and bankers, so the communist Bolsheviks targeted the Jews. Everybody else targeted the Jews because they were communists. So they were being accused of being capitalists and communists. The Russians accused the Jews of sympathizing with the Germans because Yiddish sounded a lot like German. There were a lot of relations between Jews and Germans, so the Russians accused them of sympathizing with the Germans. The Germans accused the Jews of sympathizing with the Russians and didn't trust them. The Ukrainians accused the Jews of siding with the Poles, and the Poles accused the Jews of siding with the Ukrainians. And the truth is, the Jewish community was very divided. There were Jews on all sides of the conflict, meaning that whichever side of the conflict you were on, you could find a Jew to blame. So everybody was blaming the Jews for one reason or another, a predicament that we are all probably very familiar with. So that's a lot of the motivation of these pogroms, is just blaming the Jews for being on the other side. But this bandits is a whole nother situation. And these bandits are like the Lyachovich gang that I talked about earlier. They're the local toughs, the peasants from the surrounding countryside who invade the towns to attack the Jews. This is an image of a ransacked Jewish store in the town of Zhytomyr after a pogrom. And you'll see that most of the stores were owned by Jews. When you went to Ukraine, or still, the downtown core were Jewish stores. There were Jewish dry goods stores, Jewish blacksmiths, Jewish tailors, Jewish, coopers, all had their little stores in the market square, and the peasants would come in and buy from them and take it to the countryside. This, by the way, is not all that different than the way the United States used to be in the early 20th century. I'm writing a book now about the Jewish community of the Western United States, actually about the Galveston movement that some of you may know about. And, I go to towns in Oklahoma, in Texas, whatever. You go to the center of town, you see in the center of town, all of the stores have Jewish names on it, or were Jewish department stores, because that's something the Jews did. So when there's war, and when the countryside is starving, they invade the city to ransack where the goods are, to get the alcohol, to get the grain, to get the foodstuffs from the city, the dry goods stores. So from the peasant perspective, they're just taking their due. They're starving and they're coming into town in order to get food, and the people who own the food stores happen to be Jews, and so they fall target to it. In fact, you can see that the military units do that the same. The military couldn't support its soldiers, so they allowed their soldiers to feed themselves, to get provisions by going into the towns they conquered. So the army would come in, the soldiers haven't been fed, they don't have proper boots, and the commander of the army would say, go into the village and everybody get yourself some new boots. And they would go to the village and they would go to the bootmakers and they would steal the leather and say, make me boots. And the bootmakers would say, no, I'm not going to make you boots. I don't have the money, I don't have the leather. And they would kill them and take the boots for themselves. So this is a pogrom. This is how the pogroms took place. So a lot of the motivation was theft, was provisions. Another big motivation was the association between Bolsheviks and Jews. And this became extremely potent during World War I and during after the Bolshevik Revolution, and more so in World War II. It was the main way that the Nazis gained support in Ukraine when they invaded in 1941, and this is one of the direct links that I make between these two pogroms, is the association between Jews and Bolsheviks. Now, there were some prominent Jews who were Bolsheviks, right? Most prominently Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky, a name that you probably have heard of, born Lev Bronstein, was the head of the Red Army. He was the most visible person in the Bolshevik Revolution, more so than Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin led the revolution, but he was sitting there in Petrograd. He was sitting in St. Petersburg, far away from the front. Trotsky was, first of all, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and second of all, the head of the army. He is the one who was out in Ukraine, who was out in the West, who was negotiating with the Western powers, who was leading the army. He was the most visible person in the Bolshevik Revolution. And the opponents of the revolution, the old elites, used that as a way to discredit the revolution by claiming that they're all Jews. Don't trust them, they're all Jews. And they did it through propaganda like this. This is a coat of arms. It says the coat of arms of Lev Trotsky. And it's an image of the Janus-faced Russian imperial eagle. This was the symbol of the Russian state, an eagle facing both ways. But of course, you can see instead of an eagle, it's a caricature of a Jewish face with the hooked nose and the big lips and big ears, wearing a skull cap and the hammer and sickle in front of it. Coat of arms with a Jewish star that says Talmud in Russian. And instead of holding a Fabergé egg and a scepter, holding garlic and fish, which is supposed to be, the smell of the Jew, just equating all Jews with Bolsheviks. This type of propaganda was spread all over the countryside, convincing the victims of Bolshevism that they were not the victims of Bolshevism, they were the victims of Jews. And here you see an even more powerful image of it. This is a group of Red Army, of Soviet soldiers and sailors, leading Christ to the cross. Instead of the biblical Pharisees, instead of the Jews leading Christ to the cross, a narrative that most Christian peasants would be familiar with, they've turned those Jews into Bolsheviks, equating them and saying the Bolsheviks are the people who killed your God. The Bolsheviks are the Jews. And there you see Leon Trotsky, the famous face of Leon Trotsky, looking on. So this type of propaganda really convinced the masses that the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, were their enemy, and that the Bolsheviks were the Jews. And it became more powerful image because at a certain point, the Bolsheviks stopped targeting Jews. They stopped committing pogroms or atrocities against Jews. So army after army would come into town, and each army would come into the Jewish town. They would round up the Jewish population in the center of town. They would rob them. They would take them to the outskirts of town. They would kill some of them. And this was happening army after army. The Red Army, though, would come into town, and they did not target the Jews. The Red Army would come into town, and they would gather the Jews together, and they would say, hey, we didn't come here to kill you. We came here to save you. We are going to save you. We're going to protect you. The Red Army is here to protect you. Now come join us and help us protect the Jews in the next town over. And the Jews did. The Jews joined the Red Army in huge numbers as a result. So the next town over sees the Red Army come, and lo and behold, it's Yitzchak and Avram and all of the Jews from the next village over who are now in the Red Army. And you see it in these pogrom narratives with them talking about the Red Army came to town, and who was it? I recognize them all as the Jewish tailor from the next town and the Jewish bootmaker from the next town and what have you. So this image of Jews and Bolsheviks was reinforced. It became in many ways a self-fulfilling prophecy. Finally, I want to talk about who some of the other pogrom perpetrators, those bandits who came into town. And this is an image of the warlords, the bandits associated with the gang of Ilya Struk. Ilya Struk was one of the most notorious of these bandits. And here you can see his warriors. And you may notice that they're kids. These are kids playing dress up. The outfits don't fit them. They're in a photography studio having pictures taken of themselves. They're 14, 15, 16-year-old kids. And these were many of the perpetrators of the pogroms. And we have many testimonies telling us that it was people of this age and their parents were telling them, stop harassing the Jews, you're going to get into trouble. Or we have cases of elderly peasants coming into town saying, my kid, he's really on a rampage right now, you Jews better look out, he's going to come kill you, come hide in my house, I'll save you, that sort of thing. So this was also a generational thing with the young people, the 14, 15, 16-year-olds perpetrating most of the violence. Again, I'll remind you, 20 years later, these were the 30-year-olds who were perpetrating much of the violence in 1941. And what happened to a lot of them, so some continue and perpetrate the violence, others got caught. And this is a sentence. When the Bolsheviks did take power, the Bolsheviks ended up conquering Ukraine and they took power there. And when they took power, they punished the perpetrators of pogroms. They actually went out and they looked at the villages and said, who perpetrated pogroms? We're going to punish you. And this is a sentence of 3 perpetrators of pogroms. And it says that they killed 72 people. These are 3 people who are being charged with the murder of 72 people in this town. And it says one of them is, where's the age? One of them here is 26 years old, so he's a little bit older. And another one is 18 years old. This is 3 years after the pogrom, so he was 15 years old at the time that the pogrom took place. And the sentence is death. They are put to death for the atrocities that they committed against the Jews 3 years earlier. And the judges who sentenced them to death are Judge Ratner and Judge Feldman. So 2 very prominent Jewish names who were the judges, the Revolutionary Tribunal that came into town and put these people who were 15 and 22, and the third one actually escaped, so his age isn't here, but 15 and 22, and put them to death. And these were the local peasants, and in fact, often peasant leaders. They were the young kids who were the leaders of the group of peasants who went into town. And so it creates this image of tit-for-tat violence, where now, 15 years later, 16 years later, 17 years later, these people are saying, remember what the Jews did to you. As soon as the Jews came into power, what did they do? They went and they killed our children. And now it's our time to take revenge for them, for that in 1941. So that's one major connection. Just quickly go on another, which is this immigration. That's one major connection between the pogroms and the Holocaust, what took place on the ground in Ukraine. But also, many of those who fled Ukraine, many of the Jews who fled in this massive wave of emigration afterwards, fled to Germany. Berlin, in fact, was the largest recipient of Jewish refugees from pogroms in Ukraine. And the influx of all of these Jews into Berlin created an anti-immigrant animosity, similar to the type of anti-immigrant animosity that we're seeing today. Even though they were Jews fleeing the Red Army, they were fleeing the Bolsheviks, they were interpreted as bringing Bolshevism to Germany. This is a quote by Albert Einstein, who was actually living in Berlin at the time. And he noted the confrontational attitude toward these unfortunate refugees who have escaped the hell that Eastern Europe is today has become an efficient and politically successful weapon used by demagogues. Einstein was a smart guy and realized already in the 1920s that the influx of all of these refugees is going to lead to the rise of far-right anti-immigrant parties in Germany. And sure enough, here is one of the very first issues of the Völkischer Beobachter from 1920, just a few months after the Nazis took control of this newspaper. And the headline is Gegen die Ostjuden, against the Eastern European Jews. And you can see how the Nazis used this Eastern European Jewish refugee problem as a means of gaining support. So this then is the other connection that I draw, is this wave of refugees that created these animosities around Europe, and particularly in Germany. And I think that we as historians have emphasized the role that this anti-refugee sentiment played in the emergence of early Nazism, particularly in 1919, 1920, and 1921. So anyway, I will end my remarks there and can take a few questions people have. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to open it up for questions. Again, a question ends with a question mark. So please keep it short so we can get to as many as possible.
Thank you. It was great. Is there any correlation between the assassination of the Ukrainian leader with the assassination by an Armenian of the Pasha, who was also found innocent in a trial in Germany?
Yes. Yeah, the answer is yes. There's actually a few cases correlation, I don't know, but there were a few big cases like that of individuals killing, getting off for killing people on the grounds that the person they killed was evil and perpetrated atrocities. So the one you're talking about, Solomon Tehlirian, was the Armenian who killed the Ottoman Pasha on the grounds that he was responsible for the Armenian massacre. So I think there is a correlation. I've actually written an article about that in Tablet magazine from a few years ago. Yeah, so look it up, and it kind of talks about the similarity between the two cases. So I do think there is a connection, yeah.
So, what you described in these pogroms is almost word for what we heard when we had the exhibit here before COVID of Holocaust by Bullets, that Father Dubois. Mm-hmm. Did you do any collaboration with his organization in your research?
Yeah, I've done a little bit of collaboration with his organization. So Father Patrick Dubois, for those of you who don't know, collected testimonies of atrocities that were committed against Jews in Ukraine during the Holocaust, so between 1941 and 1943. He has a website as well. The organization is called Yachad in Unam, and they have a website that has maps, and you can click on the maps and view the oral history testimonies. And yes, those testimonies are remarkably similar to the testimonies that I'm talking about from 1919. And that's one of the reasons that I think I'm able to draw that connection. The atrocities that I'm talking about are not like Auschwitz. Right? When we think of that type of bureaucratized Holocaust, it's a very different type of killing. But it is similar to the Holocaust by bullets that you're talking about. Still, there's a lot of important differences, but I think there is a connection between those, and the similarity between the testimonies is exactly the point. So yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so very much for a very powerful presentation and all the great research you've been doing. What struck me kind of listening to you was, of course, you did, again, a perfect and very well sophisticated way of presenting the story. But what it struck me that it was still largely, though you mentioned a few times, but still largely gender blind.
Sorry, largely what?
Gender blind, right? So for example, like sexual violence is part of the pogroms that we see, like, and other programs unfolding and all of it. And so I've wondered to what extent like that played a role, and if you maybe kind of can also shed some light on this. So the importance of sexual violence and like gendered violence.
Yeah. So there is a lot of gendered violence and sexual violence in the accounts that I've looked at, and I mentioned them in the book as well. People, don't like to go into that much detail about it for obvious reasons, but there's enough evidence to suggest it. And I'll say also that there's a carnivalesque atmosphere to the violence that is similar to other types of ethnic riots and similar to parts of the violence from 1941, particularly the Lviv pogrom, the Lemberg pogrom, which was one of the very first atrocities committed by German troops, or committed under the authority of German troops in what is now Ukraine in July, the very beginning of July 1941, in which naked women, naked Jewish women were paraded through the streets, and naked men as well too, actually, and dragged through the streets by their hair, all very, very carnivalesque and part of a display of humiliation, which is part of this type of violence that, yes, we see in both the early 1941 pogroms and the 1919 pogroms. So yeah, it is a part of it.
Considering his history of the Jewish people in terms of persecution and trauma throughout our history, I'm wondering to what degree the pogroms and then the Holocaust have compounded the intergenerational trauma that we suffer from as a community.
Yeah, I think it has. Certainly the people that we interviewed, the people who lived through both of these acts of violence have a lot of trauma from them. And yeah, I think it's part of Jewish trauma, Jewish historical trauma that goes up to October 7th. There's been a lot of talk about the similarity between the pogrom violence on October 7th and talk about whether October 7th constitutes a pogrom or not. which is all part of trying to connect it to this tradition of Jewish violence, of anti-Jewish violence. And I could talk about that more, but don't have to, the October 7th stuff.
I'm here.
Yeah, sorry.
I have a brief comment and a question. The comment is, my mother came from a small town called Denuf on the River San, where in 1939, when the Nazis came in, the first thing they started to do is killing Jews. And that prompted whoever was not killed to escape across the river. I was similarly really relieved when I found an account of that in a book by Ilona Adler called Survival on the Margins, from a person who came from the same town. So there's something special about seeing it as somebody else confirms the same story. My question is, I'm surprised that you didn't mention the Lvov pogrom of 1918. Because not only that it was, I have a book here written in Polish about the pogrom, apparently 70,000 Jews were murdered.
In 1918?
Okay, maybe I got it wrong, but what is unusual about it, not only that the Polish army and officers were involved, but also many of the notables in the city, doctors, etc., etc. I wonder whether you could say something about that.
Yeah, so I talk about that a lot in the book, actually. I'll tell you the specific pogroms that I talk about right now are the ones that I have good video on, that I have good testimony on, because that's good to show in a talk. But the book begins with the Lvov pogrom, and I don't remember the figure who were killed, but I think it's more like 70 people. But in any case, it was one of the very first pogroms carried out at the same time that the Ukrainian state is declared. This is the town of Lvov. There's two states that are declared in the same town at the same time, a Ukrainian state and a Polish state. And in the city of Lvov is about 1/3 Polish, 1/3 Ukrainian, 1/3 Jewish. The Poles obviously side with the Polish state, the Ukrainians side with the Ukrainian state. The Jews try to stay out of it. But as a result, both sides end up accusing the Jews of being on the other side. And so there is violence perpetrated against the Jewish community. And this is the same town that the first pogrom in 1941, the July 1st, 1941 pogrom takes place. And the violence in 1918 is also very public, very celebratory, and very carnivalesque in the same way. So it is a very important pogrom in what ends up happening, and is the first in this whole new series.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I was really very interested. In the map that you showed of the pogroms, you list the town of Justengrad. My father was a survivor of the Justengrad pogrom. And there is a book written on the events in Justengrad, Sokolivka, two different names of the same town. And it's published, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, the Justengrad, Sokolivka, or perhaps the other way around. Basically, everything you said is in that book. So thank you, and my question is, are you familiar with the book?
I am familiar with the book, and it's a Yizkor book. It's a memorial book that was written for the town, yeah. Yeah, it's one of the better ones, also with an English translation. So yeah.
But it has a long Yiddish description in the second half of the book.
Yeah, and it was recently republished with the English translation, so that's, but yeah.
I just have a question for you of what is over here, that's okay, what the Jewish population is like now in Ukraine and how are Jews perceived?
So the Jewish population in Ukraine right now is pretty small. We don't know how large it is. I think if I get this figure right, it was estimated to be about 40,000 before the war, maybe even double that. The problem is it really depends on how you count. There are many Jews who intermarried. So if you count the children of intermarried, does it matter? Do they have to affiliate as Jewish, or are you counting, a drop of Jewish blood, halachic definitions, however you want to count it. But I think the reasonable estimates from before the war began ranged from about 40 to 60,000. And a lot of that, 40 to 60,000, have subsequently left. But probably still, I don't know, half that maybe. But it's a difficult question. We don't really know the numbers, and it's debated. Oh, and how are they doing now? Well, one of them is the president of Ukraine. And by the way, when Zelensky became president, there was a Jewish prime minister. So for about 4 months, Ukraine had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister at the same time. And, you know, Zelensky has identified with his Jewishness more and more as the war has progressed. Particularly at the beginning of the war, he used to, you know, not only is Zelensky Jewish, but it wasn't an issue in his election. Nobody made it an issue, nobody talked about it, everybody knew. He was a very well-known comedian. Everybody knew who he was from his television show and from his, you know, public comedy and stuff. And everybody knows that every comedian is Jewish. So they all knew, I mean, it was very well known that he was Jewish. It just didn't really matter to anybody. So I think that tells you something about the state of the Jewish community. And, you know, Ukraine right now is pretty, well, at least before the war, was pretty friendly to the Jews who were there. There was a lot of interest in the history of the Jewish community, a lot of awareness of what happened to the Jewish community, or maybe I should say growing awareness to about what happened to the Jewish community. Young people were very interested in it. When we were doing our research and wandering around looking for elderly Jews, everybody was very interested to help us. And yeah, so I think it was, and statistically, you know, when Ukrainians are asked, would you mind having a Jew as your neighbor, they do these surveys for all European countries, and Ukrainians are one of the more favorable to that question. They don't mind having Jews as their neighbors. The far-right anti-Semitic parties in Ukraine receive very few votes. They got about 2% of the total vote in the last election. So Ukraine is still pretty friendly to Jews, although there aren't very many of them there right now, other than the president.
Hi.
So that's my brother asking a question, by the way.
Okay.
Just so if you hear that he sounds like me, which he could just ask me after, too.
Yeah, but I figured people will benefit from this question. That's why I'm going to ask it. 2 questions. So just what you were talking about now, can you give some sense of how big the Jewish population was during the height of Judaism in this region? Because I think we all think of kind of Judaism as a minority religion, and of course it was, but less so than I think one might realize. Like, what size was it?
Yeah, so depending on what borders of Ukraine we're talking about, there were between 2 to 3 million Jews living in Ukraine, constituting about 12% of the total population of Ukraine. So significant, you know, if you think that Jews are, what percentage of the US population? 2% of the US population. And I mean, there's a lot of them, like look around, but even outside of the Jewish community center. But so 12% is a significant presence, and that 12% were concentrated in certain areas. But the difference is, you know, other communities were concentrated in like one territory, right? So you could have a whole province that was majority Polish or majority Ukrainian or majority Russian for that matter, whereas Jews lived in towns all the way across Ukraine. So they're concentrated in the town, and in the town they were a majority and they felt like a majority. You know, the town spoke Yiddish, but the countryside didn't. So within the areas that they're living, I mean, Jews could very well go through much of their lives interacting only with Jews, particularly in big cities like Berdichev, Zhytomyr. They could easily, you know, interact, or at least primarily, with other Jews in their lives. So they feel like they're a majority in the town that they're living in, but in the wider society, they're a minority. So I think that answers, I hope.
With that, I want to thank Professor Veidlinger. Thank you very much for being here. This was incredibly informative. I know that I connected a bunch of pieces with the Holocaust by Bullets exhibit that we had here, which also brings full circle the bias inside us and the importance of thinking about our neighbors, thinking about how we think about our neighbors and why we think that is so important. So you inspired a lot of that thinking. In addition to this program, we also have the Triumph of Spirit. art exhibit, which is photographs and stories from survivors of the Holocaust. Renee Rockford, who is the CEO of Jewish Colorado, actually wrote a book, and these photos are actually from that book and from that experience. And on March 6th will be the opening. She'll be here to be able to talk about it as well and learn from that experience. I'm so grateful for you coming to town and being part of this important lecture series and learning that we do about Holocaust education. Thank you, Larry, for inspiring all of us to be able to continue this work in the memory of Irene Rosenschein, who is such a beloved member of this community. And with that, the professor will be around for more questions. If you have them, please feel free to ask. We're very sorry that the book was not here. Not more to that. But hope you will all go off right now and buy the book. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.